thanks so much for all the insight. I'm sure the audience has several questions, so why don't we open already the floor to the question from the audience, and otherwise I also follow up, or maybe you have also questions from each other, so I want also to open that. So, any question? Yeah.
What would be your most optimistic scenario of the world in, say, 10 years, and what do you actually think it will probably be like in 10 years?
I don't know, who wants to?
I have a go at that while everybody thinks. But I think what I think there's certain, we are close to certain tipping points in some of the solutions that we need. We are now reaching a point, as Leo talked about solar, for example, where we are reaching a point where this becomes the norm. And I think in 10 years we will have to safely be on some of those tipping points. In 10 years, renewable energy will just be the no-brainer. That's what everybody does, and few people still have old-fashioned gas-fired power stations, but that will feel a bit quaint. Everything new will be green and clean. I think in 10 years, you can say the same thing about cars. Everybody who buys a new car will buy an electric car. They will have a good range. They will sort of, will know how to recharge them. So we will be past the tipping points in 10 years on some of those technologies. We will hopefully reaching tipping points in some of the other things where we're still quite far away from those. Hopefully building emissions, maybe heat pumps are something reasonably acceptable in 10 years' time. Maybe eating meat on weekends rather than always might become a normal thing. So I think, in 10 years, a lot of things that look futuristic now might be the norm. That's my hope. My worry is that we're accelerating the speed at which we reduce emissions, but the climate is accelerating the speed at which it gets worse, and it is so really a race between those two trends.
Anybody?
Just to add to this, my optimistic prognosis is that we, as society members, will become more conscious. We won't need policy to do some decisions, to make some mindful decisions. So this is something that I've seen people are almost approaching in Japan when there is voluntary recycling. People are monitoring their waste. Everything is well designed in terms it's almost zero waste from the household, from the farmers. Companies work on minimizing their negative impact. So we are, as society, become so conscious about the effects of what's happening that we don't need extra regulations also to make some positive changes in the planet. So of course in Japan it's mostly motivated by the absence of the space. They don't have space for garbage disposal, essentially, or they don't have too many resources because the population is so dense. But but this is the future that we will have everywhere in 10 years, right? So ideally, we won't need to have policy making tell us what to do. We just be self-regulating.
Okay, I'll try and be optimistic, and then I'll say a few things I think. Okay, so I think that I feel quite optimistic about are also kind of very human-orientated dimensions. So I think this whole issue of the way in which the media particularly, but some actors, politicians, as in not actors, but like people out there, politicians, try to use this culture war thing in the UK to divide people who want to take action or not on climate I think that's going to be increasingly hard to drive a wedge on environmental issues as we go forward. I feel quite positive about, so like if we take the headline that you showed, Leo, from 1990, I think about who was alive then to see that, and the roles of responsibility those people are increasingly having. I see more and more when people I engage with, whatever their job is, that those people were growing up in the UK in an era when caring about the environment was just a thing that you did. And so regardless of what their job is, they see that as a dimension that's just underlying what they're doing. And I think as those people become captains of industry and the next prime minister, but 10 or something, then that's going to be a mood music underneath a lot of decisions that are being made. And I think that's not just true in the UK. So I think that also, I don't like putting the burden all on today's young people. I think today's middle-aged people are going to deliver a lot. And then the younger people of today in other parts of the world will also deliver things that are really context relevant in their countries and help make changes that we can't even imagine because those aren't our contexts. So I feel quite positive. I think those people will have to make changes actually in policy. I don't think it can be all delivered by individuals, although individuals want to do things, make a difference. But they make a difference because then people will do things professionally. So I think that whole thing will move. The things I feel pessimistic about, well, there's a pace issue. But a couple of things I feel quite concerned about. One is that we will get some things wrong in the name of the environment. And that will be a dangerous detractor to progress of things that are good for the environment. We'll get things wrong for a couple of reasons. One is because we don't know all the answers. I think you mentioned this on kind of adaptation actions in agriculture. Nobody knows. If you read something called the Adaptation Gap Report, which is the sister report to the UNEP Mitigation Gap Report, which tells you how hard it is to adapt to climate change. We literally do not know how to adapt to climate change. There are lots of adaptation actions. We don't know what works for the most part. So we'll get things wrong just because we don't know, so we have to try things out. And we're maybe not being honest enough about that because we're so nervous about bringing people with us. The second reason that we'll get things wrong is that we're being quite successful in pushing some organizations like the finance sector very rapidly in a certain direction, like net zero. And everyone says, okay, let's do net zero quicker. Let's do net zero by 2035. And we've unleashed what could be good, but what could deliver a whole load of dangerous offsets to deliver net zero by 2035, for example. All in the name of climate action, which is going to deliver some other bad social and also environmental outcomes, which is a risk. That's my first pessimistic thing. The second pessimistic thing that I'm worried about, by the way, I'm an optimist, so I think these things, we can make them not happen. But is that, I know, Sam, I once heard you answer this question. A lot of people ask the question, well, it's all very well the UK taking action, but what about all of these other countries in the world? We need to help those countries first come out of poverty, and that might mean that they, and you're probably looking at me, what am I going to say you said, but you said something very wise, I thought, which is, you have to believe and want all countries in the world to have the clean future that we think is our future in this country. My worry is that won't happen. So we're going to see a new kind of inequality within countries and between countries, where some of us, I hope that we'll be ones who are really delivering something that's clean. I can see the progress that way. It will hopefully, I believe this sounds a bit like messianic. No, not like on the side, but like a little bit brainwashed. But I do think that future will be a nicer one to live in and attractive. And there'll be other countries where, for whatever reason, they find that difficult to make those decisions quicker. They will also become less nice places to live, and will exacerbate some inequalities that already exist. I really am an optimist.
Just to give another positive example, which is touching on what you said, in my own field, I've really noticed in the last 2 or 3 years, when we're recruiting and things, that young, early career journalists want to be climate journalists or some energy journalists. If I'd asked that question 10, 20 years ago, we, as a self-described and practicing environmental journalist at The Guardian, even within The Guardian, I was sort of seen as the sort of on the lower end of the tree in terms of, you want to be a sports journalist, you want to be a theatre critic, you want to be a foreign correspondent based in New York or Paris or whatever. It's really interesting now to see early career journalists having the aspiration to want to be climate journalists because they know that it's important, they know it's global, they know it's multifaceted. It's like, to me, I've been making this case for years to other journalists. They know this is, honestly, this is one of the most fascinating beats you can work on because it has everything. It literally has everything. You've got economics, you've got cultural issues, you've got geopolitical, dynamics, and I think hopefully that has really come through. So I can see, I'm sure this is probably true in other fields where, I know in the oil and gas sector, when they're recruiting, they're now worried that they can't get the best graduates to go into their sector. It's actually seen as almost like a pariah industry in for some of the new graduates coming onto the job market. So I think that's, to me, that's just a little it's a little version of it, but I can see some positivity in just the next generation actually wanting positively to be in these jobs and be, rolling up their sleeves and working in those sectors.
Okay, maybe there was a question on the back. I just maybe had to before getting to you, like I wanted to add to what Alyssa was saying, because one of my questions for you was about really when it comes to communicating uncertainty, because all this, the recommendation of again policies and investment strategies and so on, there is uncertainty involved in it, and so I wonder, what is, how challenging it is to communicate that and to let people, politicians, accept that there is uncertainty, and that means that when they need to communicate to their voters, to their constituency, that there is a risk, and if they take certain decision anyway, it's so I wonder whether, and to which extent you are kind of, I'm sure you are all honest with your stakeholder and audience, but how you communicate that you cannot sell a solution which is 100% correct. I mean, it's science, so we know it's in some respect like what Natalia was saying, right, about the solution they propose, they're not 100% correct. So
I think that's a really important question. But going back to what Leo was saying in terms of trusted messengers, climate scientists or scientists in general are really seen as trusted messengers and to communicate around climate change. I think more can be done to help understand the uncertainties around science. I mean, if you do read the IPCC reports, there are all these brackets explaining different probability ranges, and from my time in government, that does become incredibly tricky when you're trying to write a policy brief for a minister, because you still want to be able to capture the extent to which no science is 100% certain, and that's just a part of the nature of science. But in terms of informing those decision makers who then have to go out and talk to others, they want to know black and white, tell me the number. I just want a number, I don't want a range, my stakeholders aren't going to understand this. I need to be able to say why a certain policy is the right way to go. So in the work around communication and engaging between scientists and policymakers, still a little bit more work needs to be done to help understand how to frame science in a way that can be digestible. But I don't think we should underestimate the public and audiences. People do understand, if it's explained quite clearly, that different aspects of science have different dimensions of unpredictability, or that science is continuously evolving depending on the data we have and the expertise that's building. So I don't think we can't do much in terms of explaining all the uncertainty to people, but we shouldn't necessarily underestimate their ability to understand the fact that even with certain dimensions of uncertainty and different probability ranges, decisions can still be made and are made across the political spectrum. And if you just look at economic decision making, levels of uncertainty are just that high, if not higher, than climate science decision making. So more can be done, but also we almost need to embrace that uncertainty and look at what can be done, bearing in mind the science that we have and the benefits that are going to come out of the actions that are coming out based on different dimensions of science that may have different probabilities.
Okay, I've got a few thoughts on this. The first is that sometimes, especially amongst that I work in an academic community, we hobble ourselves by thinking too much about the uncertainty. So I guess two things seem a bit contradictory. The first is, not completely ignore the uncertainty, but if we step back, we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of evidence, and we basically know the direction of travel we have to go in. We don't need to be more certain than that to do a lot of stuff that we're not doing yet. And talking confidently about our knowledge of the direction of travel is really important in terms of keeping our foot, this is a terrible metaphor, on the pedal of our electric vehicle. So that's one thing I'd say, and to help at least our academics deliver that, we do a lot of training. We do media training, and we've actually introduced a different kind of training, which is debate training. And that's particularly to deal with some of those skeptics that Leo was talking about, who've entered a new mode, where what they do is actually, they're not anymore arguing that the climate science isn't real, because there's no, to continue my term metaphor, there's no road left on in that discussion. But they do what's known as lukewarm kind of arguments, where they argue against the need for certain actions. And that plays on the need for academics who are trusted experts to feel they know a field very deeply and with certainty to address that. So we bring training to help people decide when it's appropriate to talk about this level of detail and when is it less appropriate and not necessary. So I think that's really important to keep in mind when you're sharing that. If you're getting down to kind of the detail that you were talking about, you're advising individual farmers about decisions, then you have to recognize what tools those people need to be able to make their decisions. And that's why I think it's really important that we also don't feel, as a scientific community, that it's all our own responsibility only to deal with and manage the uncertainty. Lots of people out there, let's talk about business people, they make decisions with lots of uncertainty all the time. So we're providing them with something else that they could throw into that mix and make a decision about. And those people are equipped to make decisions with uncertainty. So it just doesn't have to all be on us.
Yeah, just to reinforce what you just said, Alyssa, and give you an example of it. I mean, we have to communicate the uncertainty, we have to be clear what we know and what we don't know, and we have to be clear in saying that not knowing something isn't a reason not to get started in doing something. I give you an example. The first report of the Climate Change Committee, when we started back, I think it's in 2008, November 2008, when we made the recommendations about the first 3 carbon budgets. And we said a few things that, I'll tell you what they are and then you can laugh. We said things like nuclear is cheap, heat pumps are easy, offshore wind is expensive. The one thing that we did get wrong, it was a bit painful, was diesel is a good idea. So we said a lot of things that are wrong in that sort of first report of the Climate Change Committee. But the direction of travel wasn't wrong at all. The carbon budgets were roughly right, and we corrected the things we got wrong on the way. We learned things about local air pollution from diesel, and we learned, we were surprised or positively about the rate of learning in offshore wind and so on, and so we adjusted. So not knowing things wasn't a reason and continues not to be a reason to not get going.
Thank you. So there was a question.
Absolutely covered exactly. That was my question about the communication styles and how we make sure that the academia is able to communicate these issues. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Leo, I really liked your slide with all of the covers on storms, and it made me think that set it up amazingly for climate to come along with extreme weather for the British public. So are there other things that the British public loves or is obsessed with that we could hook climate stories to? And then my second question is, in the current political climate, is there a point in talking about climate change, or not, as an opportunity, or when should we jump back in? Any thoughts on that?
On the second point about kind of Trojan horse messaging, like can you talk about climate change without mentioning climate change? There are lots and lots of examples of that, I think. I even think, we talked about it already, it's a kind of a big thing at the moment. There's a big moment for the UK particularly, and other countries around electric vehicles. I remember doing an article for the Guardian, God, it must have been more than a decade ago, where I went to Cowley in Oxford and drove the electric Mini I drove it from London to Oxford and kind of had that range anxiety to see it on the M40 or whatever it was, to see whether it would actually run out of electricity. And I remember thinking, this is really fun to drive, just as a kind of consumer experience. Forget the whole saving the planet or whatever, or whether it does it or does it not. I just remember thinking, I don't need to have the climate change angle in this. This is just a better consumer experience. And I think that you hear that a lot now, that people are saying when they first get into an electric vehicle, they never want to go back. And so that is maybe not a great example, but there are definitely plenty of examples and ways that you can talk indirectly about climate change without even having to mention it if you think it's, like you mentioned the word public. I find that term problematic. How do we talk to the public? You have to disaggregate and atomize the public into dozens of different kind of groups, and and I think the Climate Assembly actually, which we had in the UK, and unfortunately the conclusion of it got overshadowed by the start of COVID, but it was just coming to the boil at that point, and it was just about to publish, I think when all that happened in early 2020. But that was a really, really fascinating exercise. I don't know if anyone else was on the panel was directly involved in it, but that idea that you get down, talk to a range of publics, and get quite deep actually with some of the solutions and some of the problems with the solutions, and ask some really honest and frank questions and get some genuine, honest feedback from a range of different people. I think that's interesting. I don't know if there probably were quite a few examples in the Climate Assembly where issues that were obviously about climate change and decarbonising the economy around food or things where people weren't really talking about it directly in terms of decarbonisation. Sorry, what was the first thing you mentioned?
We could link extreme weather and climate change to Britain's obsession with weather. Are there other topics that we could hook climate stories to?
Well, as you saw from the University of Colorado kind of data, extreme weather events always cause a peak in media interest, and therefore I think as a public talking point. So there's a kind of almost, it's a bad word, but almost a sort of opportunistic moment to communicate climate change. And I think I probably should hand over to Candice on this particular topic about how you communicate to, again, the public oral term, around extreme weather events and some of the bear traps and opportunities in that. I don't know if you want to speak to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I would say when it comes to extreme weather events, people forget quite quickly, and particularly when it comes to heat, research has shown that people's memories of extreme heat are still quite positive. So even if we did some research into people's understanding of the past heat wave, it will probably be consistent with past research, which shows that people's memories will be favourable. They won't necessarily remember the very uncomfortable days and nights that they experienced during the heat. So people's memories are very short, and as are people's cycles alongside that. So for example, the research that I highlighted we're doing, we've actually been funded by the LSE Urgency Grant Scheme, and the reason we've been funded by that specific scheme is because we only have a very short window to capture the experiences of the decision makers, and we're probably actually towards the end of that window now, before the cold weather plan kicks in and other political issues start taking up their interest and their bandwidth. So I think memory is a really, really important dimension there. I just wanted to touch upon your second question. Going back to what was mentioned a bit earlier on around, I think, Alyssa, you were talking about academic impact. And should we be sort of still pushing for climate change currently with what's going on in government? And I would say that although we get these spikes in terms of attention on climate change, it doesn't mean nothing's going on climate change behind the scenes anyway. And so sometimes it's okay that there are these peaks and troughs just to let these things bubble on below the surface. And in terms of academic impact, it can be quite challenging because you can have the biggest, you could go and advise the Prime Minister on going for a particular policy, but that conversation could have happened behind closed doors, and so you're not allowed to report on that in any way, shape or form, even though you've had that impact. So it can be quite a tricky domain to penetrate.
while I remember it, on Carbon Brief earlier this year, we put an FOI request into the government because just before COP26, Boris Johnson mentioned in the media interview that he had this kind of epiphany moment where he was showing these slides in 10 Downing Street, and some scientists went into 10 Downing Street, and he said, wow, and just after he became Prime Minister, he said that was my penny drop moment where I'd been pretty sceptical, to be honest, and he had, as a Telegraph columnist, we can probably remember all of us, some pretty dodgy columns that he wrote around climate change. And then so I put an FOI request into the government, and surprisingly they sent me the slides plus a bunch of emails that were about the preparation of those slides. And we did a big story on Carbon Brief, which has been one of our most popular articles this year. If you Google 11 slides Boris Johnson Carbon Brief or something, you'll find it. And it was interesting, when we published it, some scientists actually had a little debate on Twitter, I could see them doing it, saying, actually those slides are rubbish, like how did they convince the Prime Minister? And you'd never want to show those to the public, they were just way too complicated. And it's actually a really interesting little mini case study of climate comms about, like, what would you show the Prime Minister, a sceptical Prime Minister? If you had 60 minutes with them and you could show them 11 slides, what on earth would you show them? And this is an actual case study of what was shown to the Prime Minister, and he attributes it to his change of mind. So to that particular audience, you could say, tick, 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 win, 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 that really worked. But actually some other scientists said, what on earth were those scientists thinking? They were horrendous slides, way too complicated. It was a miracle that it kind of connected with him. So I mean, I'd invite you to go and look at those slides to see what you think in terms of, would you show those to your parents or your brother and sister or your aunts, uncles, your neighbour, in terms of trying to communicate the urgency and the reality of climate change?
Just one quick thing on the question, should we talk about climate, the public debate and what's happening behind the scene, as Candice said. Behind the scene, the fact of the matter is that we have to reach net zero. It's a 30-year journey, and over those 30 years we will have all manner of events. We will have recessions, we will have booms, we will have pandemics, we will have war, we will have price spikes, we will have everything. And really the challenge we have is we have to do climate policy, whatever world events throw at us. That's the real challenge. We can't just switch off. We have to do climate change throughout those sorts of cycles. We just have to find a way of doing that, even if it's behind the scenes.
Yeah, so on that, maybe a follow-up question about political instability. So the fact that, for instance, I read that piece on Boris Johnson that was really interesting, and then how it ended after. So now UK is signed for the net zero strategy and so on. But how do you cope as communicators to policymakers? So having that audience in mind when you have such high political instability now in UK, for instance. So do you decide which politician to target with your messages, or I don't know if that was, yeah.
I mean, first I'll build on something Sam just said. There's always context. There's always context. I mean, we didn't expect it to be a pandemic, and literally we changed overnight what we were saying and how we were saying it, what we were talking about. The evidence, we presented some of that same evidence that was done in Oxford about green recovery. We never talked about green recovery before because it was going to be a recovery from anything. And then suddenly, it ought to be a green one. In fact, it wasn't that different from, the direction of travel was not different. The direction of travel was the same. We thought that there should be investment in things like energy efficiency in buildings, which is part of what that report said, which if they'd have done it, it would have been better now. So there's always context, and in a way, this sounds awful, but that is what makes the job interesting. He's always got to say, who am I trying to reach, what am I trying to say, how will that message land, and that is really relevant to the context. So it can lead to extra work, but it's always kind of interesting. And yes, we do kind of map out who are we speaking to from the different political parties, who are we speaking to importantly in the civil service, so that's something like Candice indicated. There are people who don't change what they're doing all the time, even with the kind of turmoil that we have now. There are teams who've been set tasks of doing certain things in the civil service, and they're working on them still. And actually, your evidence can be really important to what they're doing. And that it takes a long time, even if some politician want to change that, for that to be totally upended. So just knowing who are those people that you want to be speaking to, that's what, going back to my kind of thing about making a plan, that's part of the plan. And then also knowing who those interlocutors are. So in recent years, we've done a lot of work with the Conservative Environmental Network. They grew significantly in membership since the last election, because what happened was, with a big influx of Conservative MPs, a lot of those MPs actually were quite committed to green issues, including climate change. Not the people that you see in leadership now, but someone like Chris Skidmore, you know, who is doing the net zero review. So actually working with that interlocuting organization who has members who are actually trying to be actors within their own group is really important. So yeah, I think we do that.
I would just add to that very quickly also that, so the work that we're doing in PCAM with the different commissions, they do bring together those different stakeholders, including the local authorities, who then can hopefully use the work of the commission to inform some of their practices, and then hopefully in some way, although we're looking into this, help it trickle back up the chain to try and inform wider national discourse on this. But then also, in terms of behind the scenes when it comes to who to target directly in policy, it can be quite difficult because ministers change all the time, as we're seeing at the moment. So we were even trying to figure out who's the DEFRA Minister for Adaptation Resilience. You know, we had to do a bit of background check, and we've got in touch with them to ask them what they're doing around heat waves. So, and then you can also engage directly with your MPs, because then they have to respond. And I know when I was working in government that we would be, those particular requests or questions to ministers, we would be the ones who would have to do the background research to help inform the response. So if it's conveyed in quite a compelling way, it can then go up on their radar, and it can be something that they want to address going forward. So there are different channels of engaging with them, but going back to what Alyssa was saying about having a strategic approach, trying to target different people in policy, is probably the most effective way to do it.
Yeah, just in the spirit of saying something positive, the UK is probably in a better position than many other countries in terms of having a certain amount of stability when it comes to climate policy, unlike, say, the United States or other Anglo-Saxon countries. Since the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008, we have, you know, those sort of set pieces that are prescribed in the Act. They have all happened. We have set carbon budgets. The government has always responded to those budgets. We have legislated certain measures to meet those budgets. There have been annual progress reports. All that machinery has happened. And it has happened over 6, soon to be 7 governments. It has happened, you know, over COVID, during the great financial crisis, at the height of the Brexit wars. The net zero target was actually legislated bang in the middle of the whole Brexit convulsions in the last week, I think it was, of the May government. So certain things in the UK have become the norm. There's sort of a rhythm of climate change debate that everybody seems to be familiar with and adhering to, whatever chaos happens around it. And that's sort of a small element of reassurance for me.
Thank you. Any question from the audience?
Thank you for the super interesting discussion. I have a question related to political instability, and I think Sam has answered part of it already. So my question is, given under the assumption that consumer preferences will not bring us to net zero, and so that we need environmental policy, what is the role of our democratic systems and the electoral cycles that every 4 or 5 years brings us instability in our path to net zero? Yeah, so I see that in the UK this is working, but maybe in other countries it's not.
Caterina, I thought you would give the answer because you know it, because it's in the paper we did together. There is a sort of a response to the business cycle and to the electoral cycle in climate change policy, globally speaking, not just in the UK. But again, there's sort of some bits are stable, some bits are not. In terms of political orientation, Anglo-Saxon countries tend to be the outliers where climate policy is really is partisan and polarized. In most countries, when we did the analysis and counted how many climate change laws are passed by governments of the left and by governments of the center and by governments of the right globally, we find that laws are passed roughly in proportion to these governments' time in office. So if the right was in power 60% of the time, they passed 60% of the laws. So that's the party politics outside Anglo-Saxon countries is surprisingly bipartisan. The thing that isn't is the business cycle. If you ask whether laws are being passed in good economic times or in bad economic times, again, if you sort of split the world into periods of economic boom and in periods of economic downturn, most of the laws, or a larger share of the laws, are passed in good economic times or in bad economic times. So the economic cycle does matter. And the bit that's in our joint paper is laws tend to be passed at the beginning of a legislative period. They don't get passed shortly before the election, which is interesting, or at least it was true when we did that a couple of years ago. It's interesting because it suggests the climate policy at that time wasn't a vote winner. You do it right after you come into power and you hope that your voters will have forgotten what you did when it comes to the next election. That was the case 7 or 8 years ago. It's quite possible that you could do it the other way around now.
It just made me think of a moment within at the Paris COP in 2015. I remember there was a little detail within it that actually turned out to be very, very crucial just a few years later, where Sue Biniaz in the US State Department, very, very kind of highly respected lawyer and kind of veteran of putting together these kind of big international treaties and negotiations and doing the text. I don't know if this is absolutely true, but I think it's been attributed to her. She managed to slip into the Paris Agreement, if you like, the clause that then became vital for when Trump became elected. So effectively, it made the Paris Agreement Trump-proof. So they purposely designed it with the full knowledge that if the US president came in that wanted to pull out of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement would survive at least one US presidential term, which is exactly what turned out to happen. So the moment Biden got elected, remember on day one, there was a picture of him signing on the desk in the Oval Office, signing the US back into the Paris Agreement. And that mechanism was like days away from, and it was designed by Sue Biniaz back in 2015, knowing that there was this risk of this kind of democratic cycle in the US coming around. So it's interesting that people have been mindful about that kind of thing, whether it probably wouldn't survive a 2-term US president wanting to pull out of the Paris Agreement, for example, but it was resilient to that. And your question made me think of that little moment and a very long-held debate, I think. I can remember asking civil servants this 15 years ago, kind of honestly, you get the difference between, say, like a China doing, a non-democratic country doing climate policy versus a modern democratic economy like, say, the UK, which has these 4 to 5 year cycles. Who in the longer game, in the longer cycle, who's going to do the better climate policy? And it's a fascinating kind of open question, but it's interesting that you've done this kind of research looking at when climate legislation gets done within political cycles. I think that's really interesting.
Sorry, I was just going to say one more thing. I think sometimes this question leads to this discussion, like people say, oh, if only we could just be autocratic and then we could just get this all done with. And I think we have to remember that, I'm also a believer in democracy, and that's really important. And actually, the electoral cycles can also bring us really positive things. So if it makes it it might make it seem or feel a little more difficult sometimes along the way. I think that what it will ultimately mean is that changes that take place, we're bringing people with us. And that's really important because changes are permanent, we're going in a certain direction. So that democratic process is vital. It also challenges, sometimes I'll say us, but people who want to see change in that direction, to make sure that it is genuinely delivering for people and for all people, or at least a kind of qualified majority of people. So it's testable. And I think also what's interesting is you see in elections now, this interplay between, like you described, people who want to take action on climate, but no, they can't do as much as they would unless there was good policy in place. Looking for people that they can vote for that also have a climate platform, which forces at least in the UK, in most parties, to have a line on climate. And even if they're not going to do tons, it means that each of those people who run for political office have had to think about what is their position on climate. But then I also go back to what Leo was saying about the deliberative democracy experiments that have been happening, not just in the UK, but also in other parts of the world, which are also saying, well, okay, maybe there's something that we're not doing quite well enough in our democratic processes that needs to be improved to bring people on board. And these like climate assemblies or similar type activities that are about deeper dives with the public and tried in other topics as well is maybe a way for us to improve our democracy while we deliver on climate.